welcome everybody again to another episode of the IdeaXme show, that profiles the humans behind the really big ideas that are shaping our world, inspiring the future and future trends, and for all those like really great stories. I'm Ira Pastor, your life sciences ambassador, along for the journey today. So the Advanced Regenerative Manufacturing Institute, or ARMI, is one of the 14 institutes of the Manufacturing USA Network, and is a member-driven nonprofit organization whose mission is ultimately to make practical the large-scale manufacturing of both engineered tissues and tissue-related technologies. BioFabUSA, which was created by ARMI, was ultimately established to lead the charge in large-scale manufacturing engineered tissues, regenerative medicine research, ultimately translating some of these breakthroughs that we've discussed on the show in the past to the larger scale manufacturing of these products, potentially changing lives for ultimate patients down the road. Dr. Alexander Titus is joining us today, and he's Chief Strategy Officer at ARMI, where he's part of the leadership team that's ultimately working to advance U.S. regenerative manufacturing industry, as well as developing various technologies for disaster preparedness. Dr. Titus's career is focused on the intersection of technology and public benefit, and he has experience spanning private and public sectors, both nonprofit and academia. Prior to being involved in ARMI, Dr. Titus was the inaugural Assistant Director for Biotech within the Office of the Chief Technology Officer of the Department of Defense. He was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense level Senior Executive in charge of the DoD's enterprise strategy for biotech, where ultimately he led the team in developing a variety of strategies for biotech modernization. He joined the DoD from McKinsey & Company, where he was a management consultant and a member of the inaugural cohort of defense and security specialists there, working on national security community on high priority issues related to organization effectiveness, leadership, and analytics. On the technical side, Dr. Titus is a trained data scientist. His expertise at the intersection of both AI and biology. Prior to his consulting roles, he was a data scientist at In-Q-Tel. He was a member of their B Next group, as well as a data scientist at Amazon, working on the Alexa artificial intelligence team, as well as at Dartmouth and the Giesel School of Medicine. He holds a PhD in quantitative biomedical sciences from the Guarini School of Graduate and Advanced Studies at Dartmouth, as well as Bachelor of Science and Bachelor of Arts in both biochemistry and biology from the University of Puget Sound. And when he's not doing all of that, he is, like some of our other guests, involved in extreme biking challenges. We recently biked from the Arctic Circle down to Silicon Valley. We'll get into that a little later on in the show. Dr. Alexander Titus, thank you for taking the time to come on the show today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Ira.
It's a real pleasure, real pleasure. We start off typically by handing our guests the floor for a little while. You really done so much in your career to date. If you could sort of take us back a little bit to the beginning, sort of who you are, a little bit of where you grew up, how you got interested in the sciences and the biologic sciences, and a little bit of your journey through academia, industry, and the military. That would be a great way to sort of lay the grounds for everything else we're going to be discussing.
Absolutely. Well, it's great to be here again. Thanks for having me on board. I grew up in Oregon, small town Oregon, just east of Portland, Oregon. So West Coast, best coast, my favorite Portland. No offense to my Maine neighbors now. But I grew up, spending all of my time outside. I was very much in the forest, in the woods. I loved ecology. I wanted to be a marine biologist for a long time. I wanted to spend all my time in my career outdoors. And so I went to a small school. The University of Puget Sound is a really cool small liberal arts school in Tacoma, Washington. And I started studying all kinds of cool stuff. It's the beauty of liberal arts. I studied all kinds of things. I took a class called The Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And my professor told me that it doesn't really matter what you study in college, because the only thing college teaches you is how to learn anything in a long weekend. and so I said, well, that's great. Then I want to, I'm going to study biology because I want to go play around in tide pools in the Puget Sound. And along the way, I started taking genetics and cell biology, and I got really interested. And then eventually I wanted to go to medical school. But it was my last semester of college. So I was planning to work for a little while before applying to medical school. And in my last semester of college, I took my first computer science class. And oh man, I fell in love. Absolutely realized I had studied not necessarily the wrong thing, but an adjacent topic that from what I really had a passion about was the computational world. And so from there, I said, well, where's the number one place in the world for computer science? And I decided that was Silicon Valley. So I kind of picked up and moved to Silicon Valley and did the kind of true like Silicon Valley legacy where I had nowhere to live. So I lived in someone's basement, found a job at a startup. But it took me a long time to find a job because back at this time, a biology degree wasn't as marketable as it might be now in the kind of modern biotech world. So I ended up working at Box, the cloud company, back when it was a growth stage startup. So it was a really cool experience, but I worked on the recruiting team. And then again, true to Silicon Valley style, I spent all my nights and weekends in my basement apartment, hacking away, teaching myself more computer science, more statistics. And I did that for a while, but then I got the itch to travel. And so I quit my job, left the luxuries of Silicon Valley and bought a one-way ticket to Guatemala and spent a year traveling through Guatemala, Belize, Mexico. And then just by happenstance, I met someone who said, hey, we're going to Australia for a while if you want to join us. And so I called my mom and said, Mom, I'm not going to be home for Christmas. I'm going to hop across the pond and go spend some time in Australia. So did that. I spent about 6 weeks living in a back of a Honda Civic, driving up and down the coast of Australia before deciding I needed to be a productive member of society again. So moved back to Seattle because I went to school just south of Seattle and got another job at a tech company in the Seattle area at Tableau Software, but this time it was much more in the data science, but on the sales side of the organization. So I was a product consultant doing all kinds of data visualization demonstrations. And it was at that time I met the woman that is now my wife. But when we started dating, she said, hey, I've got this crazy idea. We should ride our bikes from Alaska to Argentina. I said, well, that sounds like an adventure. So I called my mom again and said, Mom, sorry, I'm quitting my job. I got to follow a girl from Alaska to Argentina on my bike. And of course, as any parent out there can relate, like, what are you doing? But it was great. So then we rode from Alaska, from just Prudhoe Bay, which is about 300 miles north of the Arctic Circle, to Silicon Valley. And at that point, it was about 3,000 miles and just shy of 4 months. And I said, I think I'm probably good. I'm tired of the bike. I'm ready to go to grad school. And she was my fiance at the time. And luckily she agreed and said, all right, let's do it. And so then I was applying to grad school, but we had a little bit of time in between. So my wife was a nurse at the time. And so we ended up in Detroit on a short-term contract while she worked at the Detroit Children's Hospital. But they often provide you housing. And so they actually provided us housing in the Detroit Motor City Casino. And so I spent my full time playing blackjack while I was applying to grad school, which was a blast. And so I was interviewing for PhD programs in data science, statistics and stuff. And when I tell them that, I'm playing blackjack full time living in a casino, they always say, well, you must understand something about probability. You should come join our program. So it was a good way to stand out in a very non-traditional manner. I mean, most people I was talking to knew they wanted to go to grad school forever. They wanted to be academics. And I happened to end up living in a casino and thinking, I love statistics. I'm going to go to grad school. And so I got my PhD at Dartmouth in the quantitative biomedical sciences program, where I really got to focus on kind of the intersection of data science and biology. So I specifically studied how environmental exposures vary and how they impact cancer progression. So particularly, I developed algorithms to study new biomarkers in breast cancer. But through that, I started developing this kind of interesting intersection of the quantitative sciences and biology right at the beginning of when that was really starting to take off, and started getting noticed by a couple people, and actually had a recruiter from Bayer, the pharmaceutical company, reached out and said, hey, we're having a graduate conference. We want you to come present your research. It's a free trip to Berlin. And I said, yeah, well, who's going to turn down, I'm a grad student, who's going to turn down a free trip to Berlin? But while I was doing that, I thought this was a really cool concept. And so I actually then looked around and found the Amazon Graduate Research Conference as well, applied to present my research there. And that's how I ended up as an intern on the Alexa AI team. Had nothing to do with biology, but again, one of those kind of chance events that set me up for quite a long kind of storied career. And then through a series of very fortunate events, I made some great connections. At In-Q-Tel, I met a number of phenomenal people who worked in the national security space, because In-Q-Tel is a strategic investor that invests on behalf of the government and the national security agencies, so DoD and what have you, in companies that are relevant to defense and national security. So I got a great exposure for there, and that's how I found my way into that world. And then In-Q-Tel, McKinsey Consulting, but out of the blue, I got a call from a very close mentor of mine who said, we're going to make biotech one of the top 10 technology priorities for the DoD enterprise. And we want you to come run that for us. Come help us stand that up. And I absolutely was not going to turn down that opportunity. So I joined the Department of Defense, and when I walked in, I said, all right, how do you define, they're like, we want you to help us do biotech modernization. And I said, all right, how do you define biotech? And they said, that's your job. I said, all right, well, how do you define modern? And they said, that's your job too. Go. Like, all right, well, in an organization, so the DoD is about 3 million personnel and $700 billion a year. And the vast majority of those people are what I affectionately call the zoom and boom people. So jets and weapon systems, and these are very common. So the conceptually, the green squishy goo that everyone pictures when they think of biology was kind of at odds with what people conceptualize as kind of a core technology need for the DoD. But my team did a great job kind of really contextualizing how important biology is to the 21st century and all the decades coming from here on out. I think 2020 is the decade of the bioeconomy. I think it's going to be huge. And so we started talking, showing all the great application areas that synthetic biology can bring us with new materials and new medicines. And one of the ways I made this very tangible to people is I carried around a brick in my backpack all the time. And so these bricks were made by a company called Biomason. And this brick is there's microorganisms that produce a seashell material, calcium carbonate, that glue together the substrate and actually make real bricks. But you don't have to fire them. So they set at room temperature. So they're a lot less energy intensive. And so I'd walk into meetings in the Pentagon with a brick, put a brick on the table, and everyone said, oh, the biologist is getting serious. He's bringing a weapon to this meeting. But it really helped provide a product to conceptualize what biotech really means in the context of these big kind of traditional defense style technology areas. So I did that for a while, and then the pandemic hit. It was right about the time I was thinking of transitioning out of that job. And at the time, so this was just in April, I lived in a building in Arlington, Virginia that had almost 3,000 people in it. So it was impossible to social distance. Every time you took the elevator, it was you and 10 of your best friends. And so through another series of very fortunate conversations, I ended up at ARMI, where I'm at now, helping lead a lot of the new product and new technology initiatives focused on specifically regenerative manufacturing. But then also we have another side of what we do is focused on disaster preparedness style technology. So kind of new PPE or new therapies for pandemic infections, or new ways to model demand, that kind of stuff. And so it's been quite the ride so far, and I don't see it slowing down anytime soon.
Outstanding, outstanding. It's I'm listening to your journey. I'm excited for you as all that's been going on. Wow, it's very impressive. I completely agree with you. This is the biocentury, and really fascinating stuff so far. And I'm excited to get into some of these topics. Before we touch on ARMI and BioFab, I was wondering if you could, because we're about, our audience about half US, the remainder sort of Western EU, and some in Asia. Manufacturing USA is a really fascinating structure, a set of organizations. We have these 14 or so institutes, Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, thousands of organizations from academia, industry, all with this sort of goal, create America's future in some of these high-tech areas and sort of secure our manufacturing capabilities. Could you walk us through a little bit of history about how all this got started, and a little bit? You mentioned obviously the DoD funding, size of that funding. What are we talking about here in terms of how this is funded, how much funding goes into Manufacturing USA, and sort of is there a duration for how long this exists? Is this a temporary thing? Walk us through a little bit of that, if you would.
Absolutely. So Manufacturing USA, like you said, is currently, there's actually 15 institutes now.
Okay.
And they're all designed as a public-private partnership. And so what that means is it's the type of agreement where the federal government, so it could be the Department of Defense, which funds 8 of them, and then DOE, Energy, or Commerce, which each fund a couple of their own, comes to the table and says, we really think a certain type of manufacturing technology is going to be extremely important to the future of kind of U.S. economic growth, GDP growth, kind of the future of our economy. And so these are things like additive manufacturing, next generation fabrics, biomanufacturing from a tissue side. There's one, the Department of Commerce through NIST funds NIMBLE, which is biopharmaceuticals. Then there's flexible electronics. So there's all these different areas. It's really hard to manufacture a certain, say, flexible electronics. It's a challenging manufacturing need, and so what the investment is how do we improve the technology to do the manufacturing itself, rather than the new electronics. It's how do we innovate in the manufacturing technologies to produce new electronics or new tissues. And so this public-private partnership is saying, all right, we want to come to the table. The federal government comes to the table with somewhere between $75 and $100 million. It depends on the different institutes. And then the organizations that are allowed to apply to be awarded this, it has to be a nonprofit, and they have to come to the table with at least a 1-to-1 match for cost share. So it can be in dollars or it can be an in-kind cost share, but not at all kind of this administration versus the other. Mm-hmm. It has been strong across administrations, and I don't see it going away anytime soon. In fact, one of the things that I worked on in my previous role before leaving the DoD is starting a competition to establish the next institute, which is going to focus on bioindustrial manufacturing. So using synthetic biology to drive the forward, industrial products. So new chemicals, new materials, but produced with a biology kind of context. And so this really is investing in the US's kind of technology and economic prosperity, both, and they do that through technology, but also workforce development initiatives. So each of these institutes are charged with focusing on a certain, whether it's technical education or 4-year degree education or graduate education, or even K through 12 education, educating the workforce that are going to be needed in these kind of new innovative manufacturing domains.
Wonderful, wonderful. So then going down from that to ARMI, you have this extremely impressive sort of leadership and stakeholder councils, folks like Dean Kamen from Segway fame. You have my buddy Doris Taylor, who was on the show a few months ago from Texas Heart Institute, Lloyd Rose from the Army's Medical Research Command. A lot going on from government, from industry, from academia. Walk us through a little bit of sort of how it works all together, sort of who sets the priorities of, whether you're working on cardiovascular versus the neural development. What do you do on a given day when you're in the organization? Does military take a priority over academia? Walk us through a little bit of this, if you would, please.
We develop a technology roadmap with our membership. And so we have working groups that focus on helping lay out the technical and workforce needs for the future of these certain domains. And then, so once we have a technology roadmap, for example, then ARMI and BioFab will issue project calls, so kind of funding announcements, looking for organizations, whether it's companies or academia, to help solve some of those technical gaps. So solve the ability to do this kind of bioreactor, or this kind of new sensor, or this kind of new tissue scaffold. And so it's not so much the we're not in the game of picking winners, saying this is a more important tissue type than the other. It's saying if the whole field of regenerative manufacturing takes off, which is the field of actually manufacturing tissues. Regenerative medicine is kind of the development of the tissue. Regenerative manufacturing is being able to make that. And we work on having scalable, modular, automated, and closed systems, which means you can take a system just like you would have like a Model T production line in the early 1900s. How do you go from bespoke by hand in the lab by PhD trained experts to being able to, manufacture a heart or skin or blood, things like that. And so we focus on a lot of the technologies that are going to be key to unlocking all of those areas. So a new sensor, for example, if right now, most the ways we measure biology is by actually destroying the sample. So it's a destructive type of assay where we take the cell, we grind it up, we do whatever we need to it to measure it. But how do you develop non-destructive ways to measure biology? So that way you're not actually damaging whatever product you're trying to develop. And so that measurement technique would be useful no matter what type of cells you're working on. Another example is kind of new sterilization techniques or new types of bioreactors that make it more effective and more cost effective or efficient to grow different types of cells. And so while our technical team is the expertise in that domain, on the commercial side, which is the side that I work on, it's looking for one, strategic partners. So Rockwell Automation is a strategic partner of ARMI, and they're key to helping us develop automation in these manufacturing processes. And then what are the other kind of strategic partners along the way? And then along with that, it's what are the business partnerships we can build to actually commercialize some of these technologies. So some of the technology that's developed is going to be commercialized by our members. Some of the technology is something that we would consider commercializing. So what's the best way to get these technologies that are really kind of unlocking to the future of this industry to market so people have the ability to actually buy it, use it, and benefit from it when they're developing these technologies. So all of this is done with a long-term vision. So the DoD is investing in this because they recognize the benefit to their soldiers and sailors and airmen, and then also the benefit to U.S. healthcare. And so there's not so much a DoD versus commercial priority because the underlying need for the technology is the same. But we will have other, we do take projects, specific projects at times that we help kind of co-develop, and those will then be, does this have an application to the DoD? So for example, you could think maybe new skin because burns or blood replacements or anything else that is related to maybe trauma, or, a big problem with a lot of service members is they have knee problems, ACL tears, that kind of stuff. So how do you, one of our first targets was ligaments and bone ligament bone constructs that you could then work on being able to replace those types of damaged tissue.
Very interesting, really interesting. Really, when you go to the BioFab site, and it talks about some of these thrust areas that you were just mentioning, and the fact that you were saying how you cover everything, not just from sort of, I know the regenerative medicine industry for a decade or so has been very sort of stem cell centric, but you go through a lot of what's important in terms of how you make a tissue, how you keep that tissue alive, you preserve it, mature it, and so forth. As you were saying, a heart is not a cardiomyocyte. There's a lot that goes on in getting there. You're involved in sort of taking a lot of these technologies. We'll talk about biofabrication, robotics, maybe some of the data technologies that you've been involved in, maybe artificial intelligence, bringing them all together. We talked about some of these a bit on the show in the past in terms of, say, bioprinting. We did an interesting show recently with a researcher that's actually looking at natural biomaterials like eggshells and leaves to sort of help guide formation of tissue from cells. What are some of the most interesting technologies that you see, or that you see sort of, or envision, whether they've scaled up or not, when you sort of like think of that Model T plant in the morning and turning it on, and wow, here all our biofabrication devices, robots and whatnot working. And then second to that, what are you most excited about in terms of hearts coming off a production line, or kidneys, or what gets you excited the most when you think of that factory running in the near future?
It's a great question. I think that for me, the part that is, so I have biology training, but I'm a data scientist at heart. And so it's the pairing of data analysis and the power of modern AI with what we do with the biology. So on the biology side itself, one of the things that constantly blows my mind is how we can take, say, a vial of stem cells and drive those stem cells into completely different tissue types, starting from the same fundamental cell source, to then be able to grow organs and tissues that are much more complex than a single cell type. So that innate control of the kind of progression of cell differentiation just blows my mind. But a lot of that is made possible by our increasing ability to measure more, and then use that data to do better predictions for what's going to be useful. So we spend a lot of time looking for what, critical process parameters or attributes of tissues and products that are going to show that they're going to be high quality, that are going to be able to be medically approved by the FDA for some time to use with patients. And so it's understanding what kind of biomarkers you need to look for. So if you have this kind of cell signaling, it may be, as just a standard pipetting by hand process, you would never be able to ask all the questions needed to isolate a specific biomarker that you had no idea was important. Because kind of traditional science, the core of science is the hypothesis-driven method,
Sure.
Which we still work with hypothesis, but what AI really brings and modern data science really brings to the life sciences is hypothesis triage. So instead of saying, I'm going to test one hypothesis at a time, you say, let's measure every single surface marker of this cell, every single one of them. We have no idea which one's important, but let's measure them all. And if we do that enough times, we can start to say, from a data-driven manner, actually, these surface markers that indicate something that we thought had absolutely nothing to do with our process are actually really what is critical to the ability for this cell to grow or whatnot. And so we can then say, all right, well, now we have we go from 1 million candidates to 25 candidates, and now let's do actual experiments to prove out why which of those candidates make sense in terms of what we measure and how the kind of final product comes out. And this is, I mean, we've been doing this kind of product quality in other products. Microelectronics and any kind of electronics has had lots of kind of data-driven product quality attributes. When you run and test a circuit, you can tell exactly where the circuit fails, and you know whether or not that product is good. But our ability to do that with biology is only just really coming into its full-fledged ability to be leveraged. And so that's the part that really excites me, because to me, biology is really a data field. It's just data locked in an analog storage device. Because if you think everything that a cell does and everything our bodies do is derived from DNA, which then gets translated into the physical world that does things. So the more we understand that kind of messaging system, the better we can control what's going on. And then we have standardized, scalable processes. And so when I think, if you have a warfighter, if I were going to go science fiction, and only lightly science fiction, you have a warfighter who is injured in the battlefield and gets airlifted to a hospital where they're stabilized, then they get airlifted into their kind of more long-term hospital while they recover before they get brought home. At that point, a physician through their medical record could say, this person is going to need a kidney transplant because of the injuries they received in service. And at that time, it could kick off a manufacturing process using the cells that were stored from the service member before they were deployed to actually manufacture. And so you get home, and 60 days later, you have your own kidney to replace as a transplant. So you don't have you don't have to worry about rejections. Your recovery time is better. Your quality of life is better because you don't have to live on dialysis for the rest of your life. And all in a way where you get injured, we know what's wrong, we start the manufacturing, and it happens in a way that is in a meaningful time frame to make someone's life better. That's the kind of science fiction that is only science fiction right now, because we're 3 steps from it instead of 1 step from it. But it's going to happen soon.
Absolutely, and it must be fascinating making it happen. So I've been talking about these things for decades, but we're here. So
yeah.
It's not science fiction anymore. Really impressive. You're also, as you mentioned in the beginning, you're still involved in security and disaster preparedness. We did spend a little time, Tara O'Toole came on the show a few months ago from In-Q-Tel to talk about biological security. We had Wendy Dean on from the Henry Jackson Foundation talking about sort of radiologic and chemical countermeasures. Any interesting, obviously we could see the sort of the regenerative medicine potential for taking care of somebody after some type of disaster event. Obviously nothing confidential, but any interesting things you're looking at on these particular fronts at ARMI, and also any interesting COVID-related stuff that maybe I know sort of early on when people were sort of using the shotgun approach to what could be useful in COVID. I know stem cells were talked a little bit about and so forth. Anything interesting on sort of dealing with pandemics, whether current or moving forward?
So I would say I'm going to slightly answer a different question, because we are doing some cool stuff related with COVID, but we're not quite ready to talk about it.
That's right.
But one of the conversations that's often happening in the biodefense pandemic preparedness world is the risk that synthetic biology poses to the future of pandemics. So can you make a pandemic worse, more scary on purpose? And there's a lot of conversations around, we need to be careful that we don't enable that. But what I often like to talk to people about is that, if you think of, if synthetic biology makes all of these scary possibilities, then what it also enables is the ability to fight those scary possibilities. So the Moderna vaccine is a good example of a new type of vaccine approach that we've never had a vaccine approved with an mRNA-based vaccine, but advances in how we manage biology and manipulate biology is allowing us to respond, at least one company, to respond to that threat. And so the more that pandemics become more prevalent as we, the issue is we're starting to intermix, we're continuing to intermix humans and animal habitats where a lot of that spillovers happen. But as we advance our understanding of biology and our ability to engineer it, we also enhance our ability to build medical countermeasures and other cool ways to recover and respond to those. So if you have all of these scary options, but then all of a sudden you have all of these solutions to these scary options, then we start to have, we can maintain that parity at the same time. Those same advances then can be used for, say, our ability to manufacture pharmaceuticals more efficiently in the US, or our ability to mine rare earth metals in a way that's more environmentally appropriate for our EPA regulations, or our ability to engineer hearts, those same advances. So, right, they're not the same outcomes, but our ability to do that engineered biology is really unlocking a lot of those application areas. And so the investments that that's why the DoD is investing in biotech and in synthetic biology, is because the more we can unlock our ability to make biology and biological engineering a real engineering discipline, the more we can do really cool, cutting edge, life-saving work. At the same time, that opens opportunities to reduce the risks that come from, malintent from bad actors. Is oftentimes, when these conversations, there's a lot of conversation about dual use, which is true. We want to have responsible technology development, but that's true of really any technology. The same electrical engineer could make a pacemaker or a pipe bomb. And so the intent behind it is important. And so I just had a great conversation with a social scientist earlier this week who's thinking of how do we develop a culture of responsibility into the entire discipline. And I think that's a great idea. Of course, you always have to have real checks and balances, laws, policies, technology, but building in a culture of responsibility, that fundamental understanding that you need to be a good citizen with your science and tech, I think goes a long way. And so this is a long rambling way to answer kind of what's going on in COVID, but I think that a lot of the advances we're seeing right now are going to make responding to future pandemics much easier to do. We're already seeing the time to vaccine candidate go from years to months, and that's this year. And where we're going to be with engineered biology 5 years from now, we're going to be light years from where we are right now, because of how quickly things are progressing. And so that gives me a lot of hope for kind of responding to the next one.
Appreciate that perspective. Yeah, I mean, we thinking about this, synthetic biology, and we get those questions occasionally. But I like the way you put that all together. It's an extremely important way of looking at it, and appreciate that. A couple more things. I don't know if this is maybe a bit of a silly question, but I got to ask it anyway, because I was looking at the Manufacturing USA focuses. The one thing that's not on there, there's nothing that has anything to do with food. And I'm bringing this up because we've done a few shows in the past with folks that are doing things on the cellular food front. And these companies they're fascinating. They're very good at making a $250,000 hamburger or a $50,000 piece of sushi, but they need manufacturing too. And I was just wondering, has anyone come to you yet, wanting to, because we eat, I forget what the number was, but we eat something like 80 billion tons of chicken and pork and beef in this country, and there's a whole industry sort of there on the side that's looking to make everything in a lab at some point in the future. Anything beyond regenerative medicine you're looking at in terms of potential next generation foods from this type of processing?
We have lots of conversations with cultured meat companies, because if you think about kind of cultured meat is the ultimate application of tissue engineering.
Sure.
Because you can no longer, right, it's all about what the market can bear. And in a lot of what regenerative manufacturing is enabling from the healthcare side is solutions to people who have healthcare issues, diseases, that there is no other solution. So your standard of care is nothing. And so that allows so you can have a higher cost of product, which means, someone would pay, if you're going to die or get a heart transplant, that heart is worth a lot of money to you, which means while technology is still expensive and not as efficient as it could be, there is still a market to drive those product developments forward. But that also then drives down the cost as we get better at that, both of healthcare, but then of our ability to engineer a lab-grown steak or a lab-grown chicken breast, because no one's going to pay $25,000 for a piece of sushi,
Sure.
but they might pay $10 versus $5 for a piece of sushi if it was not even sustainably harvested, but just grown instead of hunting or fishing. And so we absolutely have lots of conversations with companies who are interested in that, because also the number of cells that you have to be able to grow to be able to meet those market demands, that is prohibitive in itself right now. Just the sheer, trillions and trillions of cells you have to grow. And we're not at that from a technology standpoint yet. But if we can reach those milestones, that means we are pushing the technology to a point where we really can do almost anything with it. So those are the kind of commercially viable routes that come after the healthcare applications, but they are definitely along the same continuum of technology development in the tissue engineering space.
Excellent. As coming back to you, needless to say, you've done so much so far in your career. You've been in the halls of government, academia, industry. I have to ask this question because we always ask it. I'm sure there's a lot of answers, but important influencers, mentors along the way, I'm sure you've had many, that have kept you on this path, that have kept you here as opposed to doing something else. Any specific folks you might want to shout out to at this part of the show that have been really influential in keeping you moving along on this goal?
That is a great question. And yes, the answer, unequivocally yes. And I could go back to, family is an obvious choice because I had a phenomenal family. I have a phenomenal family. And so that's where it all started. But from there, so I had 2 wrestling coaches. So I was a wrestler in high school. And I had 2 wrestling coaches that I'm still close with to this day, that were the ones who were that's where I learned to work my butt off and hold my head up when I got my butt kicked. That's where I learned the kind of humility of nothing says humble with as being just totally controlled in a nonviolent manner as wrestling. It's just like there's unequivocally, I can't move right now. I'm just going to have to accept it. But I had these 2 gentlemen, Rich Polkinghorn and Trent Kroll, phenomenal mentors to this day, close friends. I've always been very deliberate to find the mentors that I really resonate with. So my college advisor, a woman named Betsy Kirkpatrick, was the person who every time I came with a new crazy idea, this time I want to take linear algebra instead of cell biology, she'd be like, sounds great, as long as you go for it. And always never saying, that doesn't make sense. Why would you do that, right? Why would you, that doesn't align with any of your goals. And at the same time, always saying, sure, broaden your horizons. I think that sounds great. And I had the exact same experience. And that's actually how I chose the grad school mentor that I worked with, because I came in and had a conversation and said, I really want to work in your lab and I really want to do great work for your lab. But at the same time, I also want to collaborate and I want to work with lots of people and get lots of experience. And he said, absolutely, I think you should. And I said, I want to do internships. And so he said, as long as you're, meeting what we need you to do in lab, go for it. So I studied cancer biology in an epidemiology lab. And I worked at Amazon. I worked at In-Q-Tel. I lived in Washington, D.C. with my wife, we were long distance for grad school because she was at Georgetown. And every step of the way, he said, yes, if it broadens your horizons and you're passionate about it, go for it. A man named Brock Christensen. And then the most recent one, who is probably the most inspiring kind of public servant I've worked for, is the woman who's named Lisa Porter, who was the deputy CTO of the DoD. Mm-hmm. And she's the one who called me and said, we need you to come run this portion of the DoD, of our portfolio for us. And I came in and I had a very candid conversation with her and Mike Griffin, who was the CTO at the time. And I said, look, everyone's going to look at me and say, and immediately know that I'm younger than my peers. That you just can't get around that. And they said, yeah, but that's because most of the people we know trained during the Cold War. And your technology didn't even exist during the Cold War. So that's not very useful if we need an expert to help drive where we're going for the future. And it was that kind of forward vision, willingness to hire someone who wasn't necessarily the obvious choice based on kind of traditional standards of age and tenure, but was based on kind of drive, technology, expertise and connections, and an understanding of kind of the trade-off and benefits of what needs to be done in the private sector, what needs to be done in government, and how to have that good kind of balance. That was huge. And so, I mean, every single step I've had, I can pinpoint a specific person or two that were monumental in making that happen. And you asked this question because that's true for most people if they really thought about it, but I would challenge everyone to think about it at every step. One of my favorite Arnold Schwarzenegger speeches, he's giving a commencement speech, and he says, you can call me whatever you want, just don't call me a self-made man. And I think that resonates absolutely for everyone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wonderful point. Final question. When you're not planning the future of the United States regenerative medicine industry, are you getting out and doing any biking and going anywhere exotic, or are you mainly up in New Hampshire?
Well, under normal circumstances, I would be. COVID has slowed down travel a little bit,
sure.
But being in New Hampshire, so I said I grew up in small town Oregon. I basically grew up in the dirt, outside, playing outside all the time. And so that's what I spend my free time doing now. Lots of hiking. It's almost ski season, so there'll be lots of skiing. And then as soon as COVID's allowing us to travel again, and we Americans are allowed to travel to other countries again, there'll be a lot of international travel. You know, I'm from the West Coast, and so I spend a lot of time in South and Central America. But now being on the East Coast, I'm excited to spend time in Europe and Africa and get to see a whole part of the world that I haven't spent much time in. So there's a lot of that coming. We just got to get through this whole pandemic thing.
It's been a wonderful time, really impressive, and wishing you the best with this. For everybody that's going to be watching on the YouTube channel or listening on the various podcast networks, you've been listening to the very inspiring Dr. Alexander Titus, Chief Strategy Officer at the Advanced Regenerative Manufacturing Institute, doing really amazing things to advance the United States regenerative manufacturing industry, scaling it up, industrializing it so that we all have access to these opportunities to enhance and our lives and improve our quality of life. Alex, thanks for taking the time to come on the show. Thank you for everything that you're doing. And as we say on the show, thank you for moving the human story forward. It's been a really wonderful time.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.